Hello and welcome, fellow Wasteland survivors. I'm Dean. Thanks for stopping in, hanging out with me, because in today's video we're going to be taking a very close look at our new lunchbox factory. This build was suggested to us by our good friend Choppy. He wanted to see if we could build a 100% fully automated lunchbox factory and have the factory open and close all of the lunch boxes as it passed through the system. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, this is a high-tech lunchbox can opener. So we've got a lot to cover today. Let's go ahead and get started to see how this system actually works. This is the switch that we'll use to power our factory. Once main power is on, at this junction, power will split into two different directions. The first direction that it's going to run is down the side of these conveyor belts. And the first stop is the second conveyor belt of this part of the system. Once power is on, this conveyor belt will run, and it will continue to run until power is turned off. The second stop goes to this laser tripwire. Main power will also continue on through this concrete wall to this conduit connection right here. We'll use a wire and connect it to another conduit connection, and then power will flow through the conduit piping to this conduit connection, which will power this toggled on and off ball track switch, which is part of our flip-flop switch. Next, the second power will run across and underneath our forge and then be redirected to this conduit connection. From here, the power will split into two different directions. The first direction it'll go is to this NAND logic gate. Because the NAND logic gate transmits power, if one input has power, it'll send an electrical pulse to three different directions. The first one will be the first conveyor belt that will run our lunch boxes down to the second conveyor that'll always be on. The next direction that the power from the NAND logic gate will go is to this white electrical conduit. This conduit is being used to generate an electrical field that'll operate this green light that's connected to our forge. And then the third direction that power will run from our NAND logic gate is to the forge itself. So when the NAND logic gate is active, those are the three parts of the system that'll be on. The next direction that power runs to is to this laser tripwire. This laser tripwire will be used for two different counters. The first counter that it'll go to is this one on the right hand side. This counter can count up to 999. This will count how many lunchboxes we actually run through our system. The second direction power will run from the laser tripwire is to these counters. These counters will count to 21, and we'll do it by sevens. So this counter here will count to 7. Once it reaches 7, it'll send a pulse of power to the second counter, and it'll make it turn to 1. When this counter reaches 3, they will both reset to 0 and transmit power. The first place that it goes to is to this white electrical conduit, and it'll split into two different directions at that point. This electrical conduit will also be used to generate an electrical field to run this red light that is connected to our forge. Now the first direction power will run from our electrical conduit is to the NAND logic gate. Now that the NAND logic gate has two powers, it will no longer transmit power. and the 3 parts of the system that it was powering will now turn off. The second direction that power will flow is to this conduit connection right here. From here it'll follow the electrical conduit piping and go into our secondary system of our factory. This is how we'll be able to power the other part of our system. The first stop that it goes to will be to this delayed on switch, which is programmed at 10 seconds. Once it comes on, it'll send power to this NAND logic gate, which will transmit power, and it'll come out to this delayed on switch programmed at 10 seconds. Once this delayed on switch has become active, it'll be used to power the rest of the delayed on and off switches, and it will be diverted into 3 different directions. The first one goes to this delayed off switch, which is programmed at 2 seconds. It's connected to our pitching machine, which has grenades in it. The 2 seconds that it's on is long enough to pitch a grenade out of it into our boom box. The second direction it goes is to this delayed off switch, which is also programmed at 10 seconds. It runs up through our concrete wall, and it is connected to a cycling light. At this point, the cycling light will come on, and that lets us know that there is an explosive in the boombox and it's ready to be detonated. Now, the third direction that power runs is to this delayed on switch, which is programmed for 10 seconds. The reason it's programmed for 10 seconds is because it gives plenty of time for the grenade to enter the boombox and be detonated before this delayed off switch becomes active, which is connected to our door. That allows the grenade to explode, and then a few seconds to go by, the door opens, and it allows our lunch boxes to leave the boom box and enter into the rest of the secondary system. From this point on, power will continue to this next conduit connection, which is connected to this white electrical conduit, which is being used to generate an electrical field to run all of the lighting in our secondary system. Power will also continue on and around to this point where it will power all of the conveyor belts that will bring all of the lunch boxes out of the boom box and send them down the conveyor belts to a conveyor storage located at the end. Power will also run along the rest of this electrical conduit piping until it reaches this conduit connection, which is connected to a vacuum hopper. The vacuum hopper is the power point that will run the rest of our conveyor belt system. The first thing that it'll power is this sorter. It is an object sorter. So we have a Vault-Tec lunchbox inside of it. Anything that is not a Vault-Tec lunchbox will pass through and enter and be stored into this conveyor storage. The Vault-Tec lunchboxes that it sorts will run down this conveyor belt system, enter into the conveyor belt elevator, and it'll be brought back up on top of our factory, where they'll continue down this conveyor belt and pass through this laser tripwire. Every time this laser tripwire is activated, it will send an electrical signal pulse to 2 different directions. The first direction that it'll send electric to is the one on the left. It'll follow this electrical conduit piping until it reaches this conduit connection, which is connected to a counter that will count to 60. The second direction that power will run is up to this delayed off switch, which is programmed for 2 seconds. When that receives power, it will send it to this counter that's located right here. This counter counts to 20, and it does it by 2s. Once it has reached 20, it will send an electrical signal or pulse down this electrical conduit piping to this conduit junction right here. It will then be brought up to this OR logic gate, which will now transmit power, and it is connected to the NAND logic gate. At this time, the NAND logic gate now has two powers, and it'll stop transmitting power, which will shut down all of the delayed on and off switches. 2 seconds later, when the OR gate goes off, the NAND logic gate will reactivate, and all of our delayed on and off switches will recycle. Now, back on top where our counters are at that counts to 60, once they've reached 60, they'll send an electrical pulse to this delayed off switch, which is programmed to 1 second. It will send electricity down to this NAND logic gate, which will power this directional arm. Once this directional arm has power, it will flip and make this ball move up the track, and when it comes back, it'll turn this ball track switch on. Once the switch of the ball track is on, it'll send power over to our conveyor belt system to another directional arm. Once this is powered, this directional arm will close. When it's closed, all the lunch boxes will now be diverted down this part of the conveyor belt system, and they'll be deposited into this conveyor storage. Now, as our lunch boxes pass through this part of the system, they will go through this laser tripwire. This laser tripwire will help us count the 20 lunch boxes going into the conveyor storage. The counters are set to 20. Once they reach 20, it will send an electrical signal in 2 different directions. The first direction that it'll send is down into this conduit connection. Power will flow through conduit piping, and it will come out over here in this area and continue around until it reaches this conduit connection. Power will now flow up and go into this delayed on switch, which is set for 1 second as well. Power will now go down to our NAND logic gate, and from this point the NAND logic gate will once again activate our directional arm. Once the directional arm has been activated, the ball will once again roll up the track, and on its way back through, it will turn the ball track switch off. Once the ball track switch has been turned off, it will also close, or I should say open, this other directional arm that was powered and closed. Now, instead of lunch boxes flowing into our conveyor storage, the new lunch boxes will now continue down through this conveyor belt system to be dropped back down into the boom box once again. Now, the second direction that power will flow from our counter is to this AND logic gate. Once the AND logic gate has become active, it will send an electrical pulse up to this delayed off switch, which is programmed for 3 seconds. So for 3 seconds, it will transmit power, and it'll go back down here to the very first conveyor belt that is part of our first system. Now that this conveyor belt has come on, the lunchbox that was activating our power through the laser tripwire will be moved. Once that is done, the laser tripwire will shut off and stop transmitting power, which is running up into our counters that counted to 21. We'll also lose power in our white electrical conduit and to our NAND logic gate. We'll also lose power that runs to our secondary system. Once the NAND logic gate has become active again, the 3 parts of this system will start working, which is the conveyor belt, the white electrical conduit, and the forge. Now that these systems are on, our factory will create another 20 brand new lunchboxes and run them through the system one more time. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at it in action. The very first thing we have to do when we start our factory up is go to the flip-flop switch, turn it on, and turn it off. For some reason, the very first time it receives power, it doesn't work correctly. But now that we've turned it on and off, it'll work perfect every time it's activated. Now the next thing that we're going to see is our counters that count to 21. 7 lunchboxes have now passed through the system. The counter, which is number 1, has actually went to 0, which has transmitted power to counter number 2. Counter number 2 now is at 1. Since we're counting in sevens, this number will need to reach 3 before the first part of the system turns off and lets us know that we have 21 lunchboxes in the system. Now we'll take another quick look at our counters to see how they're working. Counter 1 has now reached 0, which has sent a pulse to counter 2. And now counter 2 is at 2. And we had 14 lunchboxes in the system at that point. Now the next thing that we need to do is just wait for it to reach the 21st lunchbox. When our 21st lunchbox is created and it enters the path of the laser tripwire, and we can see it's the 21st lunchbox because of the counters on the right hand side. As long as the lunchbox stays in the path of the laser tripwire, it will transmit power up and into the counters that have counted to 21. The power will also flow through these counters and into the white electrical conduit, which we're using to generate a field for the red light on the forge. Power will also go to the NAND logic gate, and now that the NAND logic gate has 2 powers, it will stop transmitting power. This is how we were able to stop the conveyor belt and keep the lunchbox in the path of the laser tripwire. Also, now we have solid power running into the electrical conduit, which is powering the secondary systems at this point. Here is another look at the 21st lunchbox, shutting the first part of the system down and activating the secondary system. Now that the secondary system is on, the delayed on and off switches will activate the NAND logic gate, and the rest of the delayed on and off switches will run through their cycle, launching a grenade, exploding it, and then a few seconds later opening the door so that the lunchboxes can pass through the boombox and into the rest of the secondary systems. Now let's go back upstairs and see what happens when our first system shuts down and our secondary systems come on. The conveyor belts have brought all of the lunchboxes over and close to the door. Our grenade is launched and then it is detonated. Once it's detonated, a few seconds later the door is opened, allowing all of the damaged lunchboxes out of the boombox. The vacuum hopper pulls them all out of the conveyor storage, sends them into the sorter, and the sorter sends them back up here to this part of the system. The laser tripwire on the left-hand side counts every second lunchbox. One lunchbox turns it off, one turns it on. Every time it is turned on, it sends a pulse to these 2 counters. The counter on the left will count to 60. The counter in front of us will count to 20. Once the counter in front of us has reached 20, it will send a pulse of power downstairs to the OR logic gate. Once the OR logic gate is activated, it makes the NAND logic gate quit transmitting power. Once that happens, it shuts all of the delayed on and off switches off. 2 seconds later, the OR gate goes off, which allows the NAND logic gate to reactivate and transmits power. At that point, all of our delayed on and off switches will run through their cycle once again. Now that our 20 lunchboxes have entered the boombox for the 4th time, the next time through it's time to store them. So the 20th lunchbox activates the laser tripwire, which the counter is now at 60, and it has activated our flip-flop switch. Once the flip-flop switch comes on, the directional arm on our conveyor belt system has now closed and will direct all those lunchboxes into a conveyor storage. Now from this angle we can see the counters on the left hand side are about ready to reach 20. Once those counters have reached 20, they'll send an electrical signal to 2 different parts of our system, one of them being the flip-flop switch on the right hand side. Once that switch has been turned off, the directional arm on the conveyor belt in the middle will now open, which will allow new lunchboxes to flow through our system and our boombox. Now from this angle we can see the counters on the right hand side just a little better. We can also see the second direction that they're transmitting power to, and that is to the AND logic gate. Once the AND logic gate becomes active, it sends a pulse of power to this delayed off switch, which is programmed for 5 seconds. The delayed off switch sends a pulse of power to the very first conveyor belt. Once that belt is activated, it moves the lunchbox out of the path of the laser tripwire. By doing this, the laser tripwire is no longer sending power into the NAND logic gate or into our secondary system. Now that the NAND logic gate can transmit power, it will start up the first part of our system and will create another 20 lunchboxes to run through our factory one more time. Okay, here comes our 20th lunchbox, which will shut down our secondary system and reactivate our forge and the first part of the system. The flip-flop switch is activated, which opens our directional arm, which will now allow the new lunchboxes to pass through the system. We can also see that we've got 39 lunchboxes instead of 40, not for sure why. But since we've opened these lunchboxes 4 times, there's not really much junk left in them. Speaking of junk, let's run down and see what we've gotten out of the lunchboxes so far. It's not real impressive. It does look like quite a few of our lunchboxes didn't open to give us the full amount of junk that we could have collected. I do believe that we could remodify our boom box a little bit better, and hopefully the grenades would actually open more of each of the 20 lunch boxes that are passing through. But I think that we have accomplished a fully automated factory opening and closing these lunch boxes. So there you go, Choppy, my friend. We were actually able to do it, and it's working pretty good. Like I said a second ago, I think we could open a little bit more of the lunch boxes if we designed our boom box a little differently. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys very much for stopping in, hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. I look forward to seeing everybody on the next video, and just like always, until then, please stay safe and peace.